Hello everyone and welcome to today's class. The topic of this chapter is monopolistic competition. We are continuing our studies of different market structures. So far we have covered perfect competition, and also in the last chapter we talked about monopoly. In this chapter we will be talking about monopolistic competition. To put it in a simple word, monopolistic competition lies between perfect competition or perfect market competition structure and monopoly. So it has some characteristic of monopoly as well as competition. So that's why the name is also the combination of monopoly and also competition. So our job is to see in this chapter what characteristics are shared with monopoly and what characteristics are shared with market and perfect competition. So in summary, it's basically firms. So there are a lot of firms and they produce different products which are slightly different. They are not completely the same or identical, but they are slightly different. But there are a lot of such firms. And if you have read the book, so a good example is the example of books, or in a bookstore you see hundreds of different books, but each book is different. Each book is written by a specific author, and one book is completely different from another book. But there are a lot of authors, so a lot of publishers who publish different books. So that's why there are a lot of firms in that book industry, for example. But there is also a monopoly power. Why? Because each author is a monopoly. So the way one author writes, for example, one novel is completely different as another person or another author write a different novel. So in that way they also have this monopoly power, because each author or each book is unique. And of course if you see it in a general view, all of them are books, but if you see from more detailed point of view, each author is basically different. So that's why it's called monopolistic competition, which lies between monopoly and perfect competition. Okay, let's start and see what are the main topics of this chapter. We will talk about what market structure lie between perfect competition and monopoly, and what are its characteristics. We will also talk how monopolistic competitive firm choose their price and the amount of quantity that they want to produce, and we will also see if they earn economic profit. And we will also talk about the welfare effect of the monopolistic competition for a society. Is it good to have monopolistic competition, or is it not good? Does it have any social costs associated to it or not? So that are the main topic. And we will also talk about advertising and brand names, and that will conclude our this chapter. Okay, so let's start with the monopoly and competition. So what is the difference between monopoly and competition? As I said, both of them are the two extremes On one hand lies the perfect competition, in which there are many firms and they produce identical products. So that's the topic we have covered about perfect competition. And on the other hand lies the monopoly, in which basically there is only one firm producing a specific product. And in between perfect competition and monopoly, whatever lies is called imperfect competition. So these are the two extremes, and whatever market which lies between these two extremes, they are imperfect competition. So there is not that much competition happening in these markets. Oligopoly is the topic of the next chapter, but it's important to talk about it here so it's much more clear for us what are the different types of competitions in a market. So in oligopoly there are only few sellers which offer similar or identical product. So again, the number of producer are few, they are not that many, and also their products are identical. In case of monopolistic competition, there are many firms which sell similar but not identical product. Remember the example of books. So there are different thousands of authors, but not all books are the same, so they are not identical. They are all books, of course, but each book is different from the other book. So that's why the book industry or the book publishing industry is called monopolistic competition, or it's a nice example to show monopolistic competition. What are the main characteristics of monopolistic competition? As we said, there are a lot of sellers, there are a lot of producers of that specific good, as compared to, for example, in oligopoly, where there is only few firms producing. And the second character, it's product differentiation. That means that each product is different from one producer to another producer. Another characteristic of this market is that entry and exit of firms are free. Any firm can enter in this market, and any firm can exit from this market. There is no barrier of, for example, from the government side to restrict entry or exit. And these are the main examples of market which is considered to be monopolistic competition. For example, apartments. There are a lot of apartments in a city, but each apartment is unique given its location, number of houses, neighborhood, and whatsoever. The example of book we have discussed, bottled water, clothing, fast food, nightclub, and so on. Okay, in this slide and in the coming slide we will go in a bit more detail and see the difference between monopolistic competition, and in this slide with perfect competition, and the next slide with monopoly. So let's see how monopolistic competition is different from perfect competition. from the number of sellers point of view, in both markets there are many sellers, and in both market it's free to enter or exit the market, and also in both markets in the long run the economic profit is zero. And the only difference here is that the products that the firm sells in perfect competition is identical. So in perfect competition, all the products are the same. Remember the example of milk, which we have given in the previous chapters, is that milk is the same, it doesn't matter which company is producing it. But in case of monopolistic competition, each product is different, or each product is identical, is not identical with another one. So each book is different from another book. And do the firm has a market power? In perfect competition they are price seekers, so they don't have any power in the market. But in monopolistic competition they have a degree of power in the market. Why? Because they have their products are identical, so in each producer can, for example, sell its book and decide on its own price. So in monopolistic competition the firm has a degree of market power. And in perfect competition the demand curve is horizontal, so it's a straight line, but for monopolistic competition it's downward sloping. So these were the main differences between perfect competition and monopolistic competition. This slide presents the difference between a monopoly in perfect and monopolistic competition using the same characteristics as in the last slide. So number of the sellers in monopoly, of course there is only one, but in monopolistic competition there are many or several. In monopoly there is no free entry or exit, but in monopolistic firms are free to enter or exit the market. In the long run, monopoly firms, they make positive profit, but monopolistic competition, because there is free entry and exit, and if there is a profit in long run, if there is economic profit in long run, that will attract more industries to enter the market, and as a result there is zero economic profit in monopolistic competition in the long run. Does a firm has a market power? In both cases, yes. In monopoly, the degree of power is much more higher as compared to monopolistic competition. Why? Because the products are not identical, but still there are other options available. For example, if you just want to read a book, you can buy any book and read it. So there are it doesn't matter if there is one company selling or one author selling the book with a higher price, you can still find another company with a cheaper price, or another type of book with a cheaper price. And about the demand curve, so in both of them the demand curve is downward sloping, and in case of a close substitute, in monopoly there is no close substitute because monopoly is the only provider of that product. But in case of monopolistic competition, as I said, there are different book publishers, for example, so there are many other close substitute available for the monopolistic competition industry. Okay, now we will analyze how monopolistic competitive firm, how they are earning profit in the short run. So there is difference between short run and long run. And in this slide we will be talking about short run profit of a firm in a competitive, in a monopolistic competitive industry. So as we said, such firms, they face a downward sloping curve. So this is the demand curve. And this is the marginal revenue curve. Remember from the monopoly chapter that the marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve, or it's below the price of the product. So the red line is the marginal revenue curve, and then the MC is the marginal cost, and ATC is the average total cost. So these are the different cost and revenue curves for a monopolistic competitive firm. Now we will see how such a firm will decide about the quantity and price of its product, and later we will see if they are making economic profit in the short run or not. So to maximize the profit, the firm produces quantity Q, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So this formula remains the same for most of the other firms as well, other types of firms as well, that the firm decides to produce a quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That was the same, for example, in the case of monopoly as well. So the quantity of output the firm chooses in this market is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that's given by the point Q. But what happens is that the price is not equal to the marginal cost, as it was the case in competitive firm. What happens is that the firm chooses the price according to the demand curve. So and the dotted line going through the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue, it continues up to the demand curve, and then the price is set accordingly. So the firm decides, okay, I have to produce at the point where my marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and if I produce that much, so how much should be the price of that? And if you already have the quantity and you have the demand, so you can find the respective price level. So in that case, the price level here is the level noted by the point P. In this shaded area, which is above the average total cost and below the price, it's the basically the economic profit that the firm is receiving. So it's the difference between the average total cost or your cost and the price that you're receiving, and that's basically the profit for the firm. In this slide we will see that how a monopolistic competitive firm will incur losses in the short run. So in which case a firm will face losses. So that will happen when, as you can see, the demand curve is below the average total curve or the average total cost. So the average total cost is higher than the price, so for this firm, the price is smaller than average total cost. So if you see, the P lies below the average total cost. That means that the price that the firm is receiving is less than the costs that the firm is incurring. So that's why the firm is incurring losses to the size highlighted in this graph. So for the firm in this situation, it has to try to reduce these losses, and that will be the condition in short run. So in summary, in the short run, under monopolistic competition, firm behavior is very similar to monopoly. Why? Because in both cases, the companies, they produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and they set the price according to the demand curve. So that was also the same in the case of monopoly in the short run. But in the long run, in monopolistic competition, because there is free entry and exit, that will drive the economic profit to zero. So as I said, if there is economic profit, that will encourage other sellers or other producers to enter into this market in the long run. And as a result of entry and exit, at one point, this economic profit will diminish, and then in the long run, there will be zero economic profit. Yeah, so these are explanation. If there is profit in the short run, new firms will enter the market and take away the demand from the existing firms, and the other way around when the market is facing losses in the short run. Now in this slide we will see what happens to a monopolistic competitive firm in the long run. So this graph is quite similar with the one with the in the short run, but the only difference is that there is no profit. So here the price equals the average total cost, as you can see in the graph, and that's the point where the demand curve also intersects with the average total cost. So as we said, entry and exit will happen till to the point where the economic profit is zero, and that's the point where price equals average total cost. There are two other characteristics of monopolistic competitive firm. The one is the markup price, and then what does this mean is that as you can see, the highlighted area is where the marginal cost is and the price of that product is. So what it means is that a firm is charging the price of any product that a firm charge is much more higher than the marginal cost of producing that product. So for example, if an author publishes a novel, so in order to produce one more book, the cost of publishing one extra book is very minimum. So it could be, for example, $2 or $3. But the price that the author will charge on each of the book is much more higher. It could be $25 or $23. So this $20 or $23 is the markup price. It's much more higher than the cost of producing that extra book. So that's why a monopolistic firm, they are charging a markup price, so they have an extra so to say profit that they receive from selling off one extra book in this example. And if you compare that with perfect competitive market, it's completely the opposite. In perfect competitive market, the price was equal to the marginal cost. So if I could reuse the example of a book in a perfect competitive market, so that will be that the author will only charge, for example, €3 for that book. Why? Because it only cost €3 to produce that book. So the marginal cost will be equal to the price of that book if it was in a perfect competitive market. And that's not the case here in the monopolistic competitive firm. And that's also one reason that monopolistic competitive firms are not maximizing the social welfare of the society, because there would be people who want to pay this marginal cost and to buy the book, but because the firm is charging higher prices, this is not happening, and that's not good for the society. So there is a deadweight loss happening there. And the next point, which I try to explain here, but it will come up in the following slide, is that another problem with the monopolistic competitive firms is that they are not producing at point where the average total cost is minimum. So as you can see here, if you see the line of average total cost and where it intersects the demand curve, that's not the point where the average total cost is minimum. What that means is that if a firm produces more and more, the average total cost will reduce. But the monopolistic competitive firms, they are not doing that. So they are not producing at the level where the average total cost is at the minimum. And there is one specific term which I will remind you later. But here you can see in the graph that the level of the production of the monopolistic competitive firm is not at the point where the average total cost is minimum, but they are producing little in order to, for example, have or charge higher costs. So that's another problem, or that's another issue with monopolistic competitive firms. And the term used for this in the book is called excess capacity. That means that the company could produce more in order to reduce the total average total cost, but it's not doing it, and it's not, for example, producing its efficient level of output. Yeah, so the excess capacity is what I've just explained in the previous slide. I did it so that you can see it in the graph. So excess capacity is the monopolistic competitor firm operates on the downward sloping part of its average total curve, produces less than the cost minimizing output. That means that the level of output is not cost minimizing. It could produce more in order to reduce its costs. And that's basically the case for the perfect competition, in which firm produces the quantity that minimizes average total cost. And the second reason that why monopolistic competitive firms are less efficient is that they charge markup over marginal cost, and that one I also explained in the previous slide. So the price is greater than the marginal cost, and the firm is charging a markup on its price. But for example, in case of perfect competition, the price equals marginal cost. Because of these two reasons that we just explained, monopolistically competitive firms do not have all the desirable welfare properties of perfectly competitive market. That means that monopolistic competitive firms are not as socially desirable as the perfect competitive markets. Why? Because first they are charging a price higher than its marginal cost, and that means that the quantity is below the socially efficient quantity level. So although we know that such firms are not socially optimal or does not maximizes the total welfare of a country, but because in the long run there is zero profit for these type of companies, it's very difficult for policymakers to manipulate or to regulate monopolistic competitive firms. So there is no such policy which will improve the situation or which will make these firms be more socially welfare, or in order to increase the social welfare of the society. And that's why most of such companies remain unregulated, and it's not easy to regulate them. One reason is that they are already earning zero profit, so any tax, for example, or any other type of intervention would probably drive the companies out of the business. And also the number of firms in this market may not be the optimum level. So there are not that many firms as required for the optimum level. And this happens because of the two external effects. One is the product variety externality. As you remember, externality is any positive or negative effect happening to a bystander in an economic transaction. So the product variety externality is a positive externality because consumers get new products. So if there is a new firm entering this market, consumers will have more variety of products to them, and that's something good. But in monopolistic competitive firms, there are only few firms or not that many firms, and that's why the level of firms are not optimum. And that leads to the situation where consumers, they don't have much options. For example, to choose from. And the second externality is the business stealing externality, and that's basically a negative externality from the point of view of other firms. So if a new firm enters the industry, what happens is that the existing firms will lose the amount of demand for their products to this new firm. So that's something negative for the existing firms, and that's why not that many new firms will, even if they enter, that's not profitable for the existing firms, or the existing firms will be negatively affected. Yeah, so as we said, monopolistic competitive firms, they are not socially optimum structure of competition, but because it's very hard to measure their inefficiencies, and also there is few tools or almost no tool for policymakers to regulate such firms. Most of such firms remains unregulated. We will quickly talk about advertising. So why monopolistic competitive firm advertise? Because they are charging a markup price and selling their product to one more consumer, basically generates profit for the firm, and that's why firms and monopolistic competitive, they try to advertise, so more people will buy from them, and that will increase their profit. If you consider in case of perfect market competition, because the demand curve is horizontal, a firm really does not have to do advertisement. So whatever they produce, it's being consumed in the market, and for them it really doesn't matter if the next buyer buy their product or not, because at the end all of their products will be sold. But in case of monopolistic competitive firms, because their demand curve is downward sloping, so that's why they try to advertise in order to generate more consumers. Yes, so in the coming slides we will talk about the social value of advertising. So some economists, they agree or they are in favor of advertising, and others are not. The critique of advertising says that it's a waste of resources and it manipulates people's taste, and also it impedes competition, so it hinders competition. But the defenders of advertising say that advertising provides useful information to buyers, and buyers will be informed about the differences in price or other characteristic of the product. So that's why advertising promotes competition and reduces market power. And there has been one study in the United States about the prices of eyeglasses, and I think you can also read it in the case study in the book, which shows that when the advertising is prohibited, the prices of eyeglasses were much more higher. And some people also see advertising as a signal of quality. So if a firm is advertising, that means that their product is of high quality because they are incurring such costs, or they can support such cost of advertising. Another relevant topic is about brand names, and most of such companies, they want to differentiate their product and they concentrate more on their brand names. For example, you see different brand names of Adidas, Nike, and other famous companies that they basically, through advertising and through brand names, they want to differentiate their products from others, and as a result also charge higher prices. And again, there are both critiques and those who are in favor of brand names. The critique of brand names, they say that it causes consumers to perceive differences that not really exist, or paying extra for the brand name is irrational. But defenders of the brand name says that it provides information about the quality of the product to consumers. And they also have an incentive to improve their quality or maintain their quality. Okay, to conclude this chapter, what we have learned is that differentiated products are everywhere, and the example of monopolistic competitive firms are a lot in an economy. Although the theory of monopolistic competition try to explain how firm behaves in this market, but from the government point of view, there is very few methods or tools or policies that could regulate such firms in these markets. Yeah, as a summary, in monopolistic competitive market, there are many firms, but their products are differentiated and it's free to enter or exit the market. One of the characteristic of this market system is that it has an excess capacity, so it can produce more in order to reduce its cost, but that's not happening. And another one is that each firm, they charges a price above the marginal cost, so they charge a markup price. Yeah, so in conclusion, monopolistic firms are not the socially optimum firms or industries, so it doesn't have all the desirable properties, for example, as it was the case in perfect competition. So as a result of markup in the prices and also excess capacity, these type of firms, they result in a deadweight loss, and also the number of firms will be too little or too much in an industry, and it also has its both negative and positive externalities that we have discussed. And finally, there is no clear way for policymakers to deal with this type of market structure. And we also talked about the advertising and brand names, that in both sides there are critiques and also those who are in favor of them. And the main reason that firms in these markets are trying to advertise their product or promote their brand name is that they want to sell more products, and because they are charging a markup prices, selling more products to the consumers will generate more profit for them. So that's why they try to advertise and they try to establish their own brand names. So that was all for this chapter. Our next chapter will be about oligopoly, and that will end this part of the book, which was about market competition. And yeah, see you in the next lecture. Goodbye.